The Burma Campaign of the Second World War stands as one of the most grueling, complex, and transformative military struggles of the entire conflict, a clash not only of armies, but of empires, ideologies, terrain, and human endurance. Fought across some of the harshest landscapes on Earth, stretching from the steaming jungles of Arakan to the towering peaks of Manipur and the wide, scorching plains of central Burma, the campaign shaped the destiny of millions and altered the balance of power in Asia. When Japan launched its lightning offensives across Southeast Asia in late 1941 and early 1942, Burma, long regarded as a quiet frontier of the British Empire, was thrust into the heart of a global war that neither its people nor its exhausted colonial administration were prepared to face. The fall of Rangoon and the Allied retreat into India marked not merely a military defeat, but a historic collapse of imperial prestige, a moment that exposed the structural weaknesses, outdated strategies, and fragile alliances underlying Britain's presence in Asia. Yet this disaster also ignited a dramatic transformation. India, reeling under the fear of invasion and political upheaval, became the fortress of the Allied counter-offensive. Under the inspired leadership of General William Slim, one of the most respected commanders of the war, shattered remnants of the Burma Army were rebuilt into the formidable 14th Army, a multinational force of British, Indian, African, Gorkha, Burmese, and American formations whose courage and cohesion would later earn them the title the Forgotten Army, despite their indispensable contribution to the Allied victory. The campaign unfolded across dramatic phases: the shocking collapse of 1942, the cautious rebuilding and strategic experimentation of 1943, the desperate inferno of Imphal and Kohima in 1944, where the Japanese tide finally broke against the grit and resilience of Allied defenders, and the sweeping reconquest of 1944 to 1945, culminating in the liberation of Mandalay and the lightning advance toward Rangoon in a race against the monsoon. Throughout the campaign, war was waged not solely through battles, but through airlift lifelines, jungle survival, political realignments, intelligence gambits, and the suffering and bravery of millions of civilians caught between armies. Burma's diverse ethnic communities, Karen, Kachin, Shan, Burmese, Chin, Rohingya, and many others, played essential but often overlooked roles as guides, porters, resistance fighters, and victims of occupation. The Japanese occupation, initially welcomed by some Burmese nationalists as a possible path to independence, soon revealed itself as a brutal regime marked by forced labor, food requisitioning, and political repression, driving leaders such as Aung San to shift alliances in the final phases of the war. The Allied reconquest did not simply restore colonial rule, it accelerated the political awakening that would propel Burma toward independence shortly after the war. Strategically, the campaign reshaped the entire China-Burma-India theater, securing the hump airlift routes, reopening land communications with China, and tying Japanese forces into a draining defensive struggle that sapped their strength from India to the Pacific. Tactically, it pioneered new methods of jungle warfare, air mobility, deep penetration operations, and integrated multinational command structures that influenced modern military doctrine. Yet beneath the broad sweep of strategy and geopolitics lies the human story: soldiers fighting malaria as fiercely as the enemy, porters carrying ammunition through monsoon rains, pilots navigating uncharted mountain storms, villages uprooted and rebuilt, commanders wrestling with impossible decisions, and ordinary people enduring extraordinary hardship. This introduction frames the Burma campaign not only as a military operation, but as a vast interconnected epic of resilience, failure, adaptation, and triumph, an ordeal that tested civilizations, broke myths of invincibility, transformed colonial relationships, and left a legacy that still shapes Southeast Asia and global military history today. To understand Burma between 1941 and 1945 is to witness the full spectrum of war, its horrors and heroics, its strategic brilliance and tragic waste, its capacity to reshape nations and expose the limits of empire. It is to see how geography, culture, technology, politics, and human determination converged in a crucible from which modern Burma, post-war Asia, and a reimagined British Empire emerged irrevocably. In the final weeks of 1941, as the world watched the Pacific erupt into flames, Burma, an often overlooked frontier of the British Empire, found itself drawn into the vortex of global war. The Japanese Empire, driven by an ambition to carve a new order across Asia, viewed Burma not simply as territory to be conquered, but as a strategic artery feeding China's resistance. Through the Burma Road flowed crucial Allied supplies supporting Chiang Kai-shek's forces. To Tokyo's strategists, severing this lifeline was essential to ensuring China's collapse. Burma's rugged terrain, dense forests, and diverse peoples had long insulated it from direct confrontation, but that isolation ended abruptly. Once Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and launched simultaneous strikes across Southeast Asia, the fate of Burma was sealed. British defenses were thin, morale unsteady, and the looming threat of invasion cast a shadow that stretched from Rangoon's docks to the highlands of Mandalay. By the beginning of 1943, the catastrophic retreat from Burma had left the Allied command reeling, but it had also created an unprecedented opportunity for reassessment. India, long treated as a rear administrative area, was abruptly transformed into the front line of a vast and evolving theater of war. With Japan occupying Burma and threatening India's northeastern frontier, British and American planners realized that holding India was not merely a defensive necessity, it was essential for any future counteroffensive. The upheaval of 1942 had demonstrated the consequences of underestimating the Japanese army, a mistake no commander intended to repeat. As refugees poured across the border and battered soldiers regrouped in Assam and Bengal, India began its metamorphosis into a fortress state. Airfields multiplied, new divisions arrived, and vast logistical complexes sprang up almost overnight. The subcontinent, with its immense manpower and industrial capacity, now became the linchpin of Allied strategy. From this crucible of urgency and reinvention, the foundation of future victory was laid. Central to this transformation was General Archibald Wavell's recognition that Burma had fallen not only because of Japanese strength, but because of Allied structural weaknesses. Training had been inadequate, coordination flawed, and logistics disastrously overstretched. Wavell initiated sweeping reforms, but it was the arrival of Lieutenant General William Slim, first as commander of XV Corps and later as head of the newly created 14th Army, that gave the Allied effort a new sense of cohesion. Slim possessed rare insight into both strategy and the psychology of soldiers. He believed that morale, training, and logistical reliability were more decisive than sheer numbers. Under his leadership, the remnants of shattered divisions were reorganized with patience and precision. Jungle warfare schools were established throughout India, teaching troops how to fight, survive, and maneuver in environments that had previously defeated them. The demoralized soldiers who limped out of Burma in 1942 gradually transformed into a hardened, confident force prepared for the brutal campaigns ahead. The strategic geography of India itself became a focal point in the Allied reorganization. The northeastern frontier, stretching from the dense hills of Manipur to the mist-shrouded mountains of Nagaland, had long been considered inaccessible. Now these regions became essential defensive buffers. Engineers carved new roads into steep mountainsides, built bridges across unstable riverbeds, and hacked supply routes through jungle terrain that had previously thwarted most human activity. The city of Imphal emerged as a critical logistics hub, its airfields humming with activity long before the dramatic battles that would engulf the region in 1944. Fortified depots sprouted across Assam, linked by a growing network of military railways. Meanwhile, Calcutta and other major ports became conduits through which American Lend-Lease equipment flowed into the theater. India's geography, once a logistical challenge, was reshaped into a formidable defensive architecture that gave the Allies strategic depth and unprecedented mobility. As 1943 unfolded, the Allies also recognized the supreme importance of air power. The lessons of 1942 had been stark. Without control of the skies, ground forces in Burma had been blind and vulnerable. Determined to prevent a repeat, the Allies rapidly expanded their aerial presence across India. The U.S. Army Air Forces played a particularly significant role, establishing bases from which bombers and transport aircraft could support operations across Burma and China. One of the most ambitious undertakings was the expansion of the Hump Airlift, an aerial supply route over the Himalayas that kept China's war effort alive after the Burma Road was severed. Though dangerous and costly in both aircraft and lives, the airlift became an emblem of Allied resolve. Simultaneously, the Royal Air Force intensified training programs to produce pilots adept at low-altitude jungle flying. Air superiority was no longer an aspiration, it became a prerequisite for every future operation. The political environment in India during 1943 added another layer of complexity to the military situation. The Quit India movement, launched the previous year, had strained relations between the British administration and Indian nationalist leaders. While the majority of Indians did not support Japanese expansion, the demand for independence grew louder as the war dragged on. British policies, such as detentions of Congress leaders, generated widespread public discontent. Simultaneously, the Japanese supported Indian National Army, led by the charismatic Subhas Chandra Bose, sought to capitalize on anti-colonial sentiment. Though militarily limited in 1943, the INA's ideological appeal complicated British mobilization efforts. Nevertheless, millions of Indian soldiers volunteered for the Allied cause, serving in the largest volunteer army in history. Their commitment, despite political turmoil, became one of the defining strengths of the Allied position in India. Logistical innovation became one of the most impressive achievements of 1943. The challenge was nothing less than the movement, feeding, equipping, and medical support of hundreds of thousands of soldiers across some of the most inhospitable terrain in the world. The British established vast logistics bases at Dimapur, Lido, and Chittagong, each capable of sustaining large formations deep into Burma. American engineers joined the effort, contributing to the construction of the Lado Road, envisioned as a replacement for the severed Burma Road. Though progress was slow and casualties high due to disease and monsoon weather, the road symbolized Allied determination to reopen a land supply route to China. At the same time, innovations in air supply, ranging from improved parachute bundles to aircraft specifically modified for jungle operations, revolutionized logistics. Never again would Allied troops in Burma suffer the starvation and isolation that had defined the retreat of 1942. While the British and Americans strengthened their conventional forces, a revolution of a different kind took place in the realm of special operations. Brigadier Ord Wingate's eccentricity and brilliance were equally legendary. He championed long-range penetration tactics that challenged conventional thinking. His Chindits, specialized units trained to operate deep behind Japanese lines, embodied a new approach to jungle warfare. Their first major operation, codenamed Longcloth, launched in early 1943, demonstrated both the potential and perils of such missions. Although the Chindits suffered heavy casualties and often depended on air supply for survival, they achieved significant psychological and strategic effects. They disrupted Japanese communications, forced the enemy to divert troops to rear areas, and proved that Allied forces could penetrate the seemingly invincible Japanese defensive web. Wingate's ideas influenced not only special operations, but broader conceptions of mobility and air supply that would shape the campaigns of 1944 and 1945. By early 1944, the Allied reorganization in India had begun to yield results. But the Japanese command believed that a bold offensive could reverse the shifting tide. General Renya Mutaguchi, commanding the Japanese 15th Army, became the architect of an audacious plan: the invasion of India itself. His vision was grand: drive through Manipur, capture Imphal, push on to Kohima, and ultimately sever the Allied lines in Assam. Mutaguchi believed that such a dramatic victory would spark uprisings across India, cripple British authority, and shift the momentum of war back into Japan's favor. Yet his confidence masked deep logistical flaws. Japanese supply chains in Burma were already stretched, the terrain ahead treacherous, and the monsoon season looming. Still, Tokyo approved the operation, codenamed U-Go. The stage was set for one of the most brutal campaigns of the entire war. What followed in the jungles and mountains of northeastern India became a desperate contest of endurance, willpower, and sheer human survival. The Allied forces, under the command of General William Slim's 14th Army, anticipated that the Japanese might attempt to strike into India, though few expected the scale of the impending assault. Slim had reorganized his army with an emphasis on mobility, decentralized command, and air supply, innovations that would prove indispensable. The British Fourth Corps, under Lieutenant General Geoffrey Scoones, deployed defensive positions around Imphal, while the vital supply hub at Dimapur lay further north. Although intelligence reports in early 1944 indicated that Japanese forces were massing in central Burma, many Allied analysts underestimated Mutaguchi's determination to undertake a full invasion. Nonetheless, Slim ordered a series of reconnaissance missions and strengthened forward positions. The Allies, having learned the painful lessons of 1942, were no longer the hollow force that had collapsed in Burma. They were ready, if not fully aware of the storm that was about to break upon them. The Imphal Valley, a plateau ringed by forested mountains, became the focal point of the Japanese advance. 3 Japanese divisions, the 15th, 31st, and 33rd, were assigned to envelop Imphal from multiple directions. Their plan called for lightning movements through nearly impassable terrain, often on narrow mountain tracks, where mules or human porters were the only means of transport. Mutaguchi believed his troops could live off the land, a fatal miscalculation in a region where even local populations struggled to survive. The Japanese infantry began their long march in February 1944, carrying limited rations and relying heavily on their reputation as jungle fighters. Initially, the speed of their movement surprised Allied outposts. Patrols reported sightings of Japanese troops far earlier than expected, prompting hurried adjustments to defensive deployments. The hills echoed with the sounds of approaching columns, heralding the brutal confrontation that would engulf the valley. One of the first major clashes took place at Tiddim Road, a critical artery leading into the Imphal Valley. The Indian 17th Division, under Major General David Cohen, had been positioned to block the Japanese advance from the south. Cohen's troops, battle-hardened from earlier campaigns, found themselves under immense pressure as Japanese forces sought to cut the road behind them. A fighting withdrawal began, one of the most skillful conducted by the Allies in the Burma theater. Engineers dynamited bridges, laid mines, and orchestrated ambushes to slow the Japanese pursuit. At the same time, Allied air supply kept the 17th Division armed and fed, enabling them to fight day after day, despite being surrounded on multiple sides. Their ability to retreat in good order, maintain cohesion, and inflict steady losses became a testament to Slim's reforms. Without their disciplined withdrawal, Imphal might have fallen before the battle had truly begun. Meanwhile, the Japanese 31st Division advanced toward Kohima, aiming to seize the ridgeline town that controlled access to the crucial supply depot at Dimapur. If Kohima fell, the Japanese could sever the Allied logistical lifeline, isolating Imphal entirely. The terrain around Kohima was among the most daunting in the region: steep slopes, dense forests, and narrow roads that made even small movements a grueling ordeal. The initial defenders, including remnants of the Assam Regiment and local levies, fought desperately to delay the enemy. British and Indian reinforcements rushed up the Dimapur-Kohima road, often arriving just in time to prevent Japanese encirclement. Commanders recognized that Kohima must be held at all costs, for its loss would unravel the entire fabric of the Allied position in northeast India. As the Japanese tightened their grip around the ridge, Kohima braced for one of the most famous sieges of the Second World War. By late 1944, the momentum of the Burma Campaign had shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. The twin victories at Imphal and Kohima had not only halted the Japanese invasion of India, but shattered their offensive capacity in the region. General William Slim, commanding the 14th Army, recognized that the moment had come to transition from defense to a sweeping counteroffensive aimed at retaking Burma. The strategic objective was clear: seize Mandalay, the symbolic and logistical heart of central Burma, and ultimately advance toward Rangoon. The terrain ahead, however, posed immense challenges: vast river systems, dense forests, parched plains, and fortified Japanese strongholds. Yet Slim's army had evolved into a formidable, highly coordinated force capable of combining mobility, air supply, and innovative tactics. What followed was an extraordinary campaign of maneuver and endurance as Allied forces marched hundreds of miles through some of the harshest conditions of the war to reclaim Burma from Japanese control. The Japanese command, reeling from catastrophic losses, attempted to reorganize its defenses under the Burma Area Army. General Hyotaro Kimura, an experienced officer with a reputation for pragmatism, assumed command in 1944. Unlike his predecessor, Michiguchi, Kimura understood the importance of logistics. Recognizing that Japan could not mount major offensives without supply lines, his objective became delaying the Allied advance for as long as possible while consolidating defensive positions across central Burma. Kimura fortified towns, repositioned surviving divisions, and attempted to bolster morale among exhausted troops. Yet he faced enormous obstacles. Supply shortages crippled his forces, desertion increased, and Japanese air power had been all but eliminated. Despite Kimura's competence, he inherited a theater already collapsing. The arrival of Allied air superiority, combined with Slim's strategic vision, meant that Japan would now fight a defensive war under conditions stacked heavily against them. One of Slim's most innovative decisions was the formation of the XXX-3 and IV Corps as spearheads of the counteroffensive. Each corps had distinct operational roles, with XXX-3 Corps advancing along the northern axis from Kohima and Imphal toward Shwebo and Mandalay, while IV Corps executed a rapid flanking movement through the Gongawa Valley. Slim believed that speed and deception were crucial. By keeping the Japanese guessing about the main Allied axis of advance, he aimed to force them into strategic miscalculations. The 14th Army's logistics network, fed by the expanding network of Indian supply bases and supported by Allied air transport, ensured that units could maintain mobility even across hostile terrain. As troops prepared for the long march southward, morale was high. Soldiers understood that the reconquest of Burma was not just a military objective, but a redemption of the painful defeats suffered in 1942. The Chindwin River became the first major obstacle in the Allied advance. Stretching across Burma's northwest frontier, the river had served as a natural barrier for centuries. Slim's engineers constructed pontoon bridges, while amphibious craft ferried men and equipment across the fast-flowing waters. The Japanese, anticipating an Allied crossing, had deployed defensive units along key points. Yet Slim's penchant for deception once again proved effective. Feints by XXX-3 Corps convinced the Japanese that the main attack would come from the north, while the real thrust emerged further south under IV Corps. By late November 1944, tens of thousands of Allied troops had crossed the Chindwin River in one of the largest river crossing operations of the campaign. The Japanese, caught off balance, were forced to fall back toward the Irrawaddy River, losing valuable time and further weakening their defensive cohesion. As Allied troops pushed deeper into Burma, they encountered a complex mosaic of landscapes: parched plains, rice fields, dense bamboo forests, and dusty roads that turned to choking clouds beneath marching boots and vehicle treads. The advance was not without fierce battle. At Pinlabu, Wantho, and Shwebo, Japanese units mounted stubborn resistance, attempting to delay the Allied momentum. Snipers, booby traps, and ambushes became common as the Japanese used their intimate knowledge of the terrain to maximum effect. Yet Allied coordination between infantry, armor, and air support steadily wore down Japanese defenses. Hurricanes and thunderbolts roared overhead, strafing enemy positions and cutting off retreating formations. Artillery units blasted Japanese bunkers, while armored cars swept through villages to secure roads. Though progress was often slow and hard-fought, the Allies continued advancing steadily southward, tightening the noose around Mandalay, the jewel of central Burma. Meanwhile, Slim's grand deception plan unfolded with remarkable success. While XXX-3 Corps advanced visibly toward central Burma, IV Corps executed a sweeping move through the scarcely defended Gangawa Valley, a route the Japanese believed impassable for large formations. Engineers worked tirelessly to improve roads, create makeshift bridges, and carve vehicle paths through jungle terrain. The Japanese, convinced that any major advance must come from the north, left the valley lightly defended. This tactical oversight proved costly. IV Corps advanced with unprecedented speed, capturing key positions before the Japanese could mount significant resistance. Slim's gamble had paid off. The Japanese command, realizing too late that their flank had been turned, scrambled to reorganize their defenses around the Irrawaddy River. By then, the Allies were already closing in. The Irrawaddy River, one of the largest in Southeast Asia, posed a monumental challenge to the advancing troops. Spanning nearly a kilometer in some sections during the dry season, the river represented the last major natural barrier before Mandalay. Slim understood that a direct assault across the river near Mandalay would be costly and predictable. Instead, he designed a complex series of simultaneous crossings along a wide front, aiming to confuse the Japanese about the primary point of attack. The crossing operations began in January 1945. Under the cover of darkness and smoke screens, Allied units paddled across in small boats, while engineers assembled pontoon bridges under fire. Japanese artillery attempted to disrupt the landings, but Allied air support quickly neutralized many enemy positions. Once bridgeheads were established, tanks and artillery rolled across, enabling deeper thrusts toward the heart of Burma. The Irrawaddy crossing became one of the defining tactical achievements of the entire campaign. As the Allies pushed toward Mandalay, the ancient city took on renewed symbolic importance. Known for its royal palace, pagodas, and cultural heritage, Mandalay represented the historical soul of Burmese identity. For the Japanese, holding the city meant preserving their last major stronghold in central Burma. For the Allies, its capture signified the nearing end of Japan's grip on the country. Japanese forces entrenched themselves in Mandalay Hill and Fort Dufferin, both formidable positions that commanded sweeping views of the surrounding plains. Mandalay Hill, with its temples and stairways ascending the slopes, became a fortress bristling with machine guns and artillery. Fort Dufferin, surrounded by high walls and a wide moat, provided a near impregnable defensive position. The stage was set for a fierce struggle that would blend urban combat, cultural preservation concerns, and operational precision. Fighting around Mandalay Hill began in early March 1945, with the Indian 19th Division spearheading the assault. Japanese snipers hidden among pagodas and shrines forced the Allies into brutal close-quarters combat. Engineers attempted to preserve religious structures where possible, but the intensity of the fighting often made this difficult. The slopes became a maze of ruined temples, bullet-pocked walls, and shattered statues. Progress was slow, but the Allied troops pushed relentlessly upward. After days of intense combat, Mandalay Hill was finally secured, allowing artillery observers to direct fire onto Japanese positions in the city below. The capture of the hill broke the psychological dominance the Japanese had held over the region and opened the way for the final assault on Fort Dufferin. By early 1945, the Allied reconquest of Burma had reached its climactic phase. With Mandalay and Meiktila secured, Japanese resistance shattered across central Burma, and the 14th Army rapidly advancing southward, the final objective came clearly into view: Rangoon. As Burma's economic and political heart, Rangoon represented the ultimate strategic prize. Its port facilities were indispensable for sustaining Allied forces through the monsoon season, and its liberation would decisively end Japan's control over the country. Yet, time was running short. The monsoon, an annual torrent that turned roads into swamps and rivers into impassable torrents, was only weeks away. General William Slim understood that unless Rangoon was captured before the rains arrived, his entire army could be stranded in the middle of Burma, short of supplies and vulnerable to disease. Thus began one of the most dramatic races against time in modern military history, a relentless push through enemy lines, dense jungles, and crumbling infrastructure to seize the Burmese capital before nature itself intervened. General Hyotaro Kinura, commanding the Japanese Burma Area Army, recognized that Rangoon could not be held indefinitely. His forces were exhausted, undersupplied, and dwindling in number. Months of retreat had eroded morale, and many units had lost more men to starvation, illness, and exposure than to Allied firepower. Yet Kimura remained determined to delay the Allied advance long enough to buy time for an organized withdrawal from southern Burma. He hoped to preserve as many troops as possible for future defensive operations in Thailand or Malaya. As such, he constructed a series of defensive positions north of Rangoon, particularly around the Sitang and Pegu rivers. However, these defenses were piecemeal and manned by troops in increasingly dire condition. Japanese leadership also misjudged the speed of the Allied advance, believing they had more time before Slim's forces could mount a serious assault on the capital. In reality, the Allies were moving with unprecedented speed. Slim's plan for capturing Rangoon, codenamed Operation Dracula, reflected his strategic brilliance and understanding of Burma's geography. Rather than relying solely on a ground assault down the main roads, Slim orchestrated a combined land-sea-air operation designed to envelop the city from multiple directions. 4 Corps would execute a rapid advance down the Irrawaddy Valley, while 33rd Corps pressed southward along the Sitang River. Simultaneously, amphibious forces under Admiral Mountbatten and Lieutenant General Philip Christison would land near Rangoon to outflank Japanese defenders. This three-pronged defensive ensured that even if one axis encountered heavy resistance, the others could maintain pressure. Slim also recognized the necessity of deception. False radio transmissions, feigned troop movements, and the creation of dummy supply dumps convinced Japanese commanders that the Allies intended to pause their advance rather than strike rapidly. The effectiveness of this deception would later shape the final stages of the campaign. The road to Rangoon was paved with significant logistical challenges. The heat of the Burmese dry season intensified as Slim's forces marched southward. Dust clouds trailed every vehicle, clogging engines and choking soldiers. Water supplies became scarce, and purification tablets were issued with strict rationing orders. Engineers worked tirelessly to repair bridges, clear debris, and maintain supply lines. Despite these hardships, the 14th Army maintained remarkable mobility thanks to well-coordinated air supply drops. RAF and USAAF transport aircraft delivered ammunition, fuel, food, and even medical evacuation teams directly to the front. The speed of the advance surprised Japanese defenders, many of whom expected the Allies to slow dramatically after securing Mandalay. Instead, Allied columns pressed forward relentlessly, crossing hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks. The race was on, and every soldier knew that the monsoon clock was ticking. One of the early obstacles in the march toward Rangoon was the WW2’s, a mountain range covered in dense jungle and crisscrossed by narrow, winding tracks. Japanese forces used the terrain to their advantage, establishing ambush positions and delaying the Allied advance with mines, snipers, and booby traps. Progress slowed as units navigated steep inclines, slippery slopes, and thick vegetation. Despite these challenges, the experience gained in earlier campaigns, particularly in the Arakan and around Imphal, had honed Allied jungle warfare skills. Gorkha and Indian battalions led the way, hacking paths through undergrowth, clearing enemy positions, and guiding vehicles along precarious tracks. Light tanks and armored cars, though hindered by the terrain, provided valuable fire support. The WW2’s campaign demonstrated once again that the Allies had mastered the jungle, transforming what had once been a Japanese advantage into a theater of steady Allied superiority. While the main forces advanced overland, the amphibious component of Operation Dracula prepared for its mission. The plan called for a seaborne landing at the mouth of the Rangoon River, supported by naval bombardment and airborne insertions. The amphibious fleet, composed of British, Indian, and American vessels, assembled in the Bay of Bengal, ready to strike as soon as inland forces neared the city. Special reconnaissance units surveyed potential landing beaches, collecting intelligence on tides, sandbars, and enemy positions. Mountbatten staff understood that the Japanese were likely to defend the river approaches fiercely, as Rangoon's port was vital for evacuation. Yet, unbeknownst to Allied planners, Japanese forces were already preparing to abandon the city. Kimura had judged correctly that Rangoon could not be defended against such overwhelming firepower. His withdrawal order, however, came too late to spare his troops from starvation and disease during the retreat southward. The Japanese evacuation of Rangoon began in late April 1945 and unfolded with tragic predictability. Lacking motor transport and harassed constantly by Allied aircraft, thousands of Japanese soldiers attempted to march through the humid jungles of the Tenasserim region toward Molveme and Thailand. Many were already weakened by months of malnutrition. Others carried wounded comrades on makeshift stretchers. Jungle diseases, malaria, dysentery, cholera, ravaged the columns. Food supplies were nearly non-existent. Desperate soldiers scavenged for roots and leaves. Some died by the roadside, too weak to continue. Allied aircraft spotted retreating columns and attacked at will, turning portions of the route into scenes of devastation. Of the tens of thousands who began the withdrawal, only a fraction would survive long enough to reach safety. Rangoon, effectively, had been abandoned, yet the Allies did not know this until they reached its outskirts. As the 14th Army approached the Sitong River, one of the last major defensive lines before Rangoon, they encountered unexpectedly light resistance. The Japanese rearguards fought bravely, but lacked the strength to mount serious counterattacks. Slim's intelligence units initially suspected a trap, as the ease of advance seemed too good to be true. Patrols pushed forward cautiously, probing potential ambush sites. When Allied forces crossed the Sitong River at multiple points with minimal opposition, it became clear that the Japanese were in full retreat. The psychological impact of this discovery was profound. Soldiers who had braced for a brutal, attritional battle felt a mixture of relief and disbelief. The road to Rangoon lay open, but the monsoon was now dangerously close. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon as the final phase of the advance began.